Welcome to the third part of this WiseOwl tutorial series on basic programming in Visual C#. In this part of the series we're going to talk about how to draw Windows Forms, and we'll begin with a reminder of how to create a Windows Forms application. We'll explain how to modify form properties to control the appearance and behaviour of a form, and also how to add controls to a form and then resize and arrange them to make the form look sensibly designed. We'll spend a little time talking about renaming controls and why it's an important idea to come up with a sensible naming convention, and then explain how to modify various control properties for various different control types. So we'll see things like text boxes and labels, numeric up and down controls, calendars and combo boxes. In the final part of the video we'll run our application to see the form running in real time to make sure that it looks and behaves sensibly according to the design. So there's quite a lot to do in this video. Let's get started. Okay, so before we can begin designing our form, we'll need to create a project in which to put it. So in Visual Studio, let's head to the File menu and choose New Project. And on the dialog box that appears, we'll make sure we're using a Visual C# template, and the specific template we'll use will be the one for a Windows Forms application. The exact example we're going to create will be based on an imaginary dating agency called WiseOwl's Dating Agency, or WODA for short. So I'm going to use that to change the name of my project from the fairly rubbish and useless Windows Forms Application 1 to WODA. I'm going to store my project on my desktop, but feel free to choose a different location if you like by clicking the Browse button and choosing a folder. I'm going to make sure that I create a directory for the solution, so it will automatically create a folder called WODA, where all my solution items will go. Then I can click OK to create the project. Eventually, when that's finished happening, I'll get a single default form called Form 1, which is a fairly boring, terrible name to describe my form. So what I'm going to do is rename it first of all, and I can do that using the Solution Explorer window on the right hand side of the screen. If you can't see the Solution Explorer, you can always head to the View menu and choose to display it from this option. What we're going to do as well when we choose to rename our form is make sure that we also update any references to that object in code. So there might be items in your project that already reference the form called Form 1. We mentioned this in a bit of detail in the previous video in the series, but if I can quickly show you in the program file here by double-clicking program.cs, it will show me that there's a line of code in here that references an object called Form 1. So if I rename this object, I have to make sure that this line of code updates as well to automatically reference the new name. So that actually happens automatically if I right-click on Form 1 and choose Rename. I have to make sure that I don't change the extension, that must remain as .cs. But if I change Form 1 to the name, let's call it WODA Application Form. And when I hit Enter, I'll get a little warning about updating references to the Form 1 object. If I click the Yes button, what we'll see happen is that that form will be renamed in code as well. So I click Yes, Form 1 changes to WODA Application Form as well. So that's just something to watch out for when you rename items. Make sure you update any references to the name of the item that you're changing. I can close down the program.cs file there now, go back to the form, and now we can start designing it. Let's start by changing a few things about the form itself, and I can do most of that using the Properties window in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. If that hasn't appeared by default, you can always head to the View menu and choose Properties window to display it. And the Properties window displays properties of whichever item you've got selected at the time. So at the moment I've got the form active, I've clicked on the background of the form, so the Properties window shows me properties of that object. If I selected a different item, so for instance if I clicked on the program.cs file in the Solution Explorer, the Properties window changes to show me properties of that item instead. If I click back on the form, I'll see properties of the form, and I can display the properties of the form object in one of two different modes. I can display them alphabetically listed, or categorized as they are currently. So when they're categorized, you get different groups of properties which you can collapse and expand individually by clicking the minus and plus symbols. If properties are alphabetically listed, then everything just appears in a single long alphabetical list. Some properties have sub-properties, so for instance the location property here, you can expand that independently and it has a couple of different properties stored inside it. But it's up to you whether you display things alphabetically listed or categorized. I'm going to switch between the two as the video goes along, but for now I'm going to go to the alphabetical list and look at a few of the basic things we can change about our form. First of all, let's change the caption that's displayed at the top of the form. It currently still says Form 1. The property that allows us to change that text is called Text. So if you're displaying your properties alphabetically listed, scroll down to the Text property. If you select a property, you'll get a brief description as to what the property is for at the bottom of the properties window, and you can change its value using the little box to the right hand side. So rather than calling this form 1, I'm going to say welcome to Woda. When I hit enter, we'll see that that updates on the form as well. There are various formatting properties you can change about the form as well. So for example, if I want to change any colours on the form, then there are several properties associated with that. So let's start with the most obvious one, the background colour of the form. If I scroll towards the top of the properties window, there will be a back colour property, which by default is set to one of the Windows system colours. If I click on the drop-down arrow next to the back colour property, I'll see that I've got a list of system colours, which are related to the Windows theme you've got applied currently. So these are all fairly boring, different shades of grey and blue in my case. I've also got a tab for web colours, which is a slightly wider choice of web safe colours with unique descriptive names, some beautiful flowery names there. And I've also got a custom palette tab as well, where I can choose any colour that I like essentially. It looks as though you have a fairly short range or small range of colours to choose from to begin with, but the two rows of blank white boxes at the bottom, you can right click on any one of those and choose a specific custom colour. So this is done using one of two different colour models, hue, saturation, luminescence or luminosity, and red, green, blue, the RGB colour model. So if you know how that works, you'll see that as you click and drag the selector around and use the slider bar to change the intensity of the colour, you'll see the RGB values change to match the selection you've made. Now ordinarily you wouldn't just guess what the settings would be. These would be defined for you, usually in some kind of corporate brand guidelines. So it's a very quick demonstration of that, one that's fairly easy to display. The NHS has their brand guidelines available publicly. So you can see they have a very specific shade of blue, which has a definition in RGB. So each of the values, red, green and blue, has a number between 0 and 255, which dictates the intensity of that particular colour. So for generating NHS Blue, I could manually set the red to 0, the green to 114 and the blue to 198, and that gives me NHS Blue. I can then click to add that colour to my custom colour palette and it will change the form to that specific colour. If I decide that colour's not for me, of course, I can change it back manually using the drop-down list, head back to the System tab and remember that it was the Control colour originally. Alternatively, I can just click into the design window and click the undo tool, which will change it back to its original colour anyway. As well as choosing a background colour for the form, I can also choose to display an image in the background, which inevitably ends up looking completely hideous, but it is possible to do. So if I scroll back up through the properties window to find the background image property, I can select it and then click the ellipsis button that appears, and that provides me with a browser dialog box to select the image I want to display. I can choose to display a local resource, so one that's installed locally on my machine, or I can choose to import it into the project resource folder. So I'm going to choose the second option to make sure that my image sits alongside all the other items that belong to my project. So I'm going to click the import button there, and then browse for an image. So on my desktop I have an image called Wise Owl, no text, which is the JPEG file, and if I click open, that will import it into the resources folder. When I click OK, so you'll see that it appears in a new folder in the Solution Explorer, wiseowlnotext.jpg, and it also appears on the form itself. So by default, mine sits in the top left-hand corner of my form, so the layout mode here is set to essentially none, I guess. If I select the form and look for the background image layout property, background image layout, it's set to none. So if I change this, I can display it tiled, which looks even more hideous, centered, so it sits in the middle of the form, stretched or zoomed, so it fills up the full form, zoom makes it retain the relative dimensions, so its aspect ratio. As I say, that looks fairly hideous if you ask me. So what I was actually going to do is actually remove that. So I can go back to the background image property, click the ellipsis button again, and select none. Now if I click OK, the form will go back to a fairly boring, but I think much nicer looking plain grey form. Rather than displaying an image in the entire background of the form, it can be a little bit of a nicer effect to display an image for the icon of the form. Now to make this work, you'll need a file that has the ICO extension, so an icon file. If you don't have one already, there are plenty of places you can go to get a converter, so you can upload a standard image like a PNG or a JPEG and have it converted by one of these online converters. Once you have one, you can use the icon property of the form to set that image to be the form's icon. So if you find the icon property, you can click on the property and again click the ellipsis button, and then you'll need to browse for where your icon is stored. So mine is again stored on my desktop, and if I click the open option, it will be set to be the icon of the form. So it's a much more subtle effect than a full background image. As well as allowing you to control how the form appears, the Properties window allows you to modify how it behaves as well when a user interacts with it. So for example, there's a property which I can see here called the form's border style. This allows you to modify what can happen to the form's border when a user is interacting with it. By default it's set to sizable, so that means a user can resize the form manually when it's running. There are various other properties available in here, or various other settings for the property. So if I choose any of the fixed options, so for instance fixed single, that means that the form's dialog box dimensions are fixed. The user can't resize it when the form's running. The other options for fixed basically change the visual style. So there's a 3D style and there's a dialogue style. So that changes subtly how the form actually appears. But all those mean that the user can't resize your form when it's running, which might be a useful idea. I'm going to set that back to sizable for now. Some other useful properties as well. You can control where the form appears by default when it first appears on screen. So if I scroll down to find the start position property, that's set to Windows default location. If I'd prefer to have my form starting in the middle of the screen, I can choose center screen, and that means that the form will appear right in the middle when it first opens. You can change the window state as well. So by default it's normal, so it will appear normally on screen, but you can control the fact that the form might appear minimized to the taskbar at the bottom of the screen or maximized to take up the full screen when it appears. I think normal, like a dialog box, a restored window as it's referred to, is a sensible idea. We can also control a couple of other things as well. So if I scroll back up, we can control things that the user can click on the form. So we have a set of 3 buttons at the top right hand corner. So at the moment we've got the control box set to true. So if I set the control box property to false, that means that the user can't click on the minimize, restore, maximize or close buttons. You can disable some of those buttons independently as well. If I turn the control box back on, we can see that there is if I scroll down to find it, the minimize box and maximize box. So you've got properties to control the maximize and minimize buttons independently. So if I choose maximize box, if I set that to false, and if I set minimize box to false, we'll see that we can't control the size of the form, we can only close it down. So there's various things you can do. I'm going to turn those back to true, so I'd like the user to be able to control that when my form is running. But don't just think of the properties window as formatting changes. Bear in mind that you can also modify the behaviour of the form as well. So far we haven't saved any of the changes we've made to the form, and you can tell that you haven't saved design changes to a form by the little asterisk that appears next to the item's name in the little taskbar at the top, the little tab. So if I were to want to save this form, I can do this in several different ways. I could just choose to close the window down and I'd be prompted to save it. Alternatively, I can manually click the save buttons on the toolbar. So if I choose to save just this form, I can click this save button. If I want to save all of my items that I've made changes to, I can click this save button. So I might have multiple items open that haven't been saved yet. You can also do it from the file menu as well, of course. You can choose the save options in here. So save just a form, save something as, or save everything that you've got open. Simplest thing to do is just to click the save button to save the form, and we should see the little asterisk disappears to indicate that we haven't made any changes that haven't yet been saved. Having changed a few properties of the form itself, the next job is to begin adding objects to it that we can use to interact with the form. So these objects are referred to as controls, and you'll find the controls that you can add to a form stored in the toolbox, which should by default appear as a tabbed document at the left hand side of the screen. If it doesn't appear again, you can use the view menu and choose to display the toolbox. To make the toolbox expand, you can simply click on the tab and that will make the toolbox pop out. And if you want to pin it in place, you can click the little drawing pin icon to pin it in place and make it not disappear when you click away from it. So I'm going to do that to make sure that I've got quick access to all the tools in there. You'll see the items in the toolbox are categorized. So I'm just going to open up the one called All Windows Forms, which shows me the full list of everything that I can add to the form currently. There's a number of different methods you can use to add items to a form. So let's start by adding a couple of text boxes. I'd like the user to be able to type in their first name and their last name into different text boxes. So if I scroll through the toolbox and find the text box control, one way to add this to the form is to simply click and drag it from the toolbox and drop it in the position you want in the form. You'll notice as you drag it towards certain locations on the form, you get little markers indicating whereabouts the item will be dragged. So it will snap to sort of a distance away from the border of the form. So otherwise in the middle it just floats around free floating. So I'm going to drag mine and position it somewhere roughly towards the top of the form. I'm not worried too much about whether it snaps to the edge or not. I'm just going to drop it somewhere roughly there. Now when you click and drag an item directly from the toolbox onto the form, when you release the mouse button the object will have a default size. Of course you can change the size afterwards by clicking and dragging on these little resizing handles to make it wider. You can also reposition it by clicking and dragging on the object itself with a 4-pointed cross cursor that will move it around the form. If you prefer to control the size of the object when you draw it on the form in the first place, another way to add an item is to click once on the object in the toolbox, and then move the mouse cursor over the form, and then click and drag to draw an item of the size you want. So I can click and drag with the mouse to draw an item the size I want. You'll notice again you get these little blue arrows and a snap to feature that helps you to draw items the same size as previous ones on the form, or snap them to the edges of the objects. Again, that's a quick useful feature for not worrying too much about the size and layout of the object. If I release the mouse button from my text box, notice that it has a single line height, so even though I dragged it out to have a multiple line height, it snaps back to a single line height. Again, I can reposition that, snapping it to the edges and a distance apart from previous controls, and when I resize it, it will snap to the border of other controls as well. As well as having the ability to type in their first and last names, I'd like the user to be able to select their date of birth. And I don't want them to have to type that in. I'm going to use a control called a date and time picker so they can select it. So I scroll up through the toolbox to find the date time picker. Another way to add a control is rather than clicking and dragging or click and then drag and draw, you can actually just double click on the tool to add it to the form. Now where the item appears depends on what it is you've got selected. So at the moment, if I've clicked once on the background of the form, if I double click my date time picker, the item will be added relative to the form, so towards the top left hand corner of the form itself. I can then click and drag to move it and position it somewhere close to my other objects. I'll resize it as well so it's roughly the same size. Now that's 3 objects drawn on the form using 3 different methods of the toolbox. Next, I'd like to add some labels that describe to the user what they should be typing into each of these text boxes. So to do that, I'm going to use the toolbox again, of course, and I'm going to scroll down to find the label control. And at the moment I've got the form selected, so I've clicked in the background of the form, which means if I double click, the label will go in relative to the form in the top left hand corner. That then automatically selects the label. So if I double clicked again to insert another label, that one will go in just slightly lower and slightly to the right of the first and select the second text box, the second label. If I carry on double clicking the label tool, you'll see each one goes in a slightly different position. If I click again on the background of the form and double click label, you'll see the last one goes in, the last one I'm going to add at this point, goes in at the top left hand corner of the form again. So that's a few too many labels for me anyway. I'm going to delete all of the ones that I've added, and the simplest way to do that is to click and drag a box that at least partially encloses all of the labels, and then press the delete key on the keyboard and they'll all be gone. What I now want to do is insert 3 labels that are positioned relative to the text boxes in the date time picker. So if I select my first text box and double click label, and then the second text box and double click label, you'll see this time the labels go in relative to the items you've got selected. So I can then click and drag to move these, and again we'll get the little indicators, little horizontal and vertical lines indicating where the items should go to position them correctly. There's an additional one when you're dragging a label next to a text box. You'll see as well as a blue line that will at this point align the bottoms of the objects together. There's a little purple one that appears that indicates that the label text will be on the same line effectively as the text in the text box. So if I do that for label 2 as well, make sure it's in line with the first label, but also make sure that the text is in line with the label with the text box. And then for label 3 is subtly different. The purple line appears at the bottom of the date time picker. So getting this one positioned in sort of precisely the same manner as the first two isn't quite so easy. So I'm going to position my label like so. And then we'll look at how we can then align these objects differently using some tools on the toolbar. Now we've seen that we get some handy little tools available to us when we click and drag objects around on a form, some little layout tools that help you to snap items to the positions of other items on the form. But if that's not enough for you to get things arranged exactly as you want them, there are a few other tools available as well. So if I, for instance, drag some of my labels out of alignment, and rather than try to click and drag them back in manually, what I can do instead is select all of the items that I want to line up, and then I can use this toolbar that appears at the top of the screen. Now, the items that appear here only become active when you have multiple controls selected, so the option I'm going to choose here is to align the lefts of my items together. Now, all of my three labels are at a different left position, so they're all in a different horizontal alignment. So how do I know which control everything gets lined up to? Well, the answer is you'll probably spot that one of these labels has a slightly different icon next to it than the other two. So this one has a white box, the other two have black boxes. So label 3 currently is the dominant control, which means if I click this little align lefts button, everything will go in line with label 3. Now if you want to make or control which is the dominant control, rather than just clicking and dragging a box around items, although what you can do instead is select the first item manually by clicking on it once with the mouse, and then hold down the control key on the keyboard and click on the subsequent other items that you want to include. What you'll see is that the first item retains the dominant control icon, the white box, while the other two now have the black boxes. So if I do that again, if I move these items out of alignment deliberately, and if I click on label 1 and then hold down control and click on label 2 and 3, when I align things to the left now, we'll see that everything goes in line with label 1 instead. There's another useful tool that helps you to align things in a horizontal line as well. So remember that for our label 3, it was quite difficult to get that positioned exactly in the same way as labels 1 and 2 relative to the text boxes. So for label 1 and 2, we've got this little purple horizontal line. But for label 3, we can only align the label to either the top or the bottom of this date time picker. So what we can do instead is select those two items. I'm going to use the click and drag method to do that, and use the align middles option. Now currently this will make the date time picker move to sit in line with the label. So what I prefer to do is select the date time picker first, then hold down the control key and select label 3, and then click align middles, and things will get lined up in a nice straight horizontal line. As well as helping you to align controls, the layout toolbar also helps you to distribute them as well. So we saw previously that when you move items close to each other, they get these little arrows, these little lines that indicate an equal distribution. So you can see we've got the little vertical line that appears when I move this little vertical line, indicating that that's an exact distance apart from the other control. Now, the spacing between these items is quite small, so if I wanted to increase that distance but still keep things nicely distributed, so let's say for instance I move my text box 1 up towards the top of the screen. I want to make the distance between text box 1 and 2 and text box 2 in the date time picker equal. So I can do that by selecting all of these items and then using the make vertical spacing equal button. So if I do that, I'll find that I get an equal amount of spacing between all of the objects that I selected. I could do the same thing with the labels. So again, if I move label 1 towards the top and make sure it's in line with the text of my text box, I can then select all 3 of my labels and click the make vertical spacing equal button, and that will position label 2 equally in between label 1 and label 3. Now, if you spent lots of time aligning and distributing your controls to make them look sensibly arranged, it can be quite annoying to accidentally click and drag to move an item out of position. So one way you can control for that is to add items to a group box, which puts things in a nice sensible group that you can move around all in one go. So to make that work, what I'm going to do is draw a group box control on the form, but I need to draw this somewhere away from the controls that I want to put into it. So I just make my form a little bit larger to begin with. What I can then do is drag a group box control into the form, and if I make sure that the group box will be big enough to contain all of the items I want it to hold, and then what I can do is select all of these other objects by clicking and dragging with the mouse, and then simply drag them inside the group box. Now when I click and drag on the group box to move it around, so I select the group box and use the little select and move cursor, I'll find that all the items within the group box go along with it. So that makes it somewhat easier to control multiple items using group boxes. It's also a relatively nice visual effect as well. You'll see this used a lot on standard Microsoft dialog boxes. Another way to help you to avoid accidentally moving things around on a form once you've positioned everything exactly as you like it is to lock the controls. And you can do that simply by right-clicking on anywhere on the background of the form and choosing the Lock Controls option. So what this does, you'll see a little lock icon appears next to the form in the top left-hand corner. And if you select an individual item on the form, you'll see you get the same little padlock icon. This means that you can't click and drag to move things around, but you can still select the item and change its properties. So it makes it easy to make sort of formatting changes and behaviour changes using the properties window without running the risk of accidentally resizing or moving items around. When you want to unlock the controls, you simply right-click on the form again and choose the same option, and then you'll be allowed to move items around again, just in the same way you could previously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click and choose to lock my controls to avoid accidentally doing that. So we've spent lots of time drawing and arranging controls on the form, but we haven't spent any time changing their properties just yet. One of the most important properties you need to consider changing about controls on a form are their names. Every object does get a default name, but they're usually fairly useless in terms of describing the items contained within them. So if you click on your first text box, for example, and look in the properties window, it's got a name called textbox1. And if I was going to refer to textbox1 in code, it would give me no indication as to what information was contained within it. So we need to think of some sort of sensible naming convention for the controls on our form. And this is going to open up a whole can of worms, because there are so many different opinions as to what constitutes a good naming convention for objects on a form. If you want a bit of advice from the Microsoft website, they do have a naming guidelines page for the .NET framework. And this gives you some links to descriptions of how to name specific types of items in your applications. The problem is it doesn't include things like form controls. They do have a slightly more general naming conventions page, which gives you some advice, some do's and don'ts for naming things. So they tend to favour more long descriptive names than using abbreviations and acronyms. And on the note of acronyms, they have one very sort of specific piece of advice about not using something called Hungarian notation. Hungarian notation was a system invented for older programming languages where you used to indicate the type of thing you were naming with a little prefix that showed you the type of thing it was. So Microsoft do still have a reference page available for Hungarian notation. So it's Hungarian notation naming conventions for Visual Basic, so it pertains to the old VB6 programming language. This is specifically here, the page is designed to indicate the names, the prefixes you would use for form controls. So you'll see for the text box, if I was going to name my text box, I'd use the letters TXT in front of its name. So I could call it TXT first name, TXT last name, and so on. The problem with Hungarian notation is it's kind of fallen out of favour. It's kind of been a little bit corrupted from its original purpose. And you'll see lots of people arguing both for and against its use. It generates some incredibly intense arguments. Just have a quick look, have a quick Google for some do's and don'ts or some good versus bad for Hungarian notation. You'll see all sorts of differing opinions on this. Some people explain why it's a good idea, so it's fairly deeply ingrained, it's fairly commonly used in older applications, so familiarity is one reason for that it seems to persist. And you also see some people getting vociferously opposed to its use. You'll see people saying no, it needs to die, some threats of physical violence, people sticking pencils in the eyes of developers who'd want to use Hungarian notation, saying it's really icky. Have a read around basically for Hungarian notation. I guess if you have a programming team that you're part of, they may already have a set of conventions in place, or they should have a set of conventions in place. So stick to the conventions they use. If they're all using Hungarian notation, I guess it's a good idea to stick to using it. If not, then don't. If it's a decision for yourself, then choose yourself whether or not you want to use it. Bear in mind that Microsoft do officially recommend not using Hungarian notation, but there are some good reasons, I guess, for still using it. If you're interested in a history of why Hungarian notation was invented in the first place, have a look at Joel on Software. This is probably the best article that describes why it was used, and a bit of the history of its development and how it got corrupted from its original purpose and why it's fallen out of favour. For us, I guess we need to think of some sort of sensible naming convention that makes sense for yourself. There are various suggestions here. Have a quick look again. You'll see some, if you quickly Google for various naming conventions, you'll see a bunch of different suggestions. So here are a few here. Some combine the name of the type of object, so text boxes, with the information that's contained within them, so name or first name. And that's something similar to the approach I'm going to adopt for this particular example. So what I'm going to do is head back to my form in Visual Studio, and text box 1 is going to contain the objects, the person's, the applicant's first name. So I'm going to start by calling the object first name, and then because it's a text box, I'm also going to append the word text box to the end. So it makes for a fairly long name, of course, but it is fairly descriptive, it's fairly unambiguous what that object contains. The most important thing about a convention, of course, is that you're consistent in its use. So it should be an all or nothing, or I guess do or do not, as Rhoda might say, approach. So if you're going to use this convention, you must stick to that for every object you add. So for the next text box, I'd call this last name text box. You might notice I'm using a lowercase first letter at the start of each word. This is something that's recommended by Microsoft, so if you have a quick look at their guidelines, their naming guidelines, they have a capitalization conventions page. Have a quick read of that to understand why you use capital letters in different ways. So it's a technique called camel case, where you have a lowercase first letter, and then each subsequent word begins with an uppercase letter. That's opposed to Pascal case, which has an uppercase letter for every single word. But we're going to use a lowercase first letter, so last name text box. Then we can move on, and I'm going to go for the date time picker. So that's going to be the user's date of birth. So I'm going to say date of birth, and I'm going to call this a picker, or I could call it a date time picker. Again, choose a convention that makes sense to you. So date of birth picker. Then I can select each of my labels as well. That's important. So I've got a label that corresponds to each value as well. So I'm going to have a first name label, and I'm going to have a last name label without the uppercase first letter, of course, last name label, and finally a date of birth label, date of birth label. The last thing I'm going to name, the last control I drew on my form, was this group box. So I'm going to select the group box, and I'm going to call this applicant details group. So you'll end up, if you're using the same convention as me, you'll end up with fairly long descriptive names. Sorry, group is what I meant to say. But there's no reason that your names can't be long and consistent. In fact, it's what Microsoft recommend. Make it obvious to, when you're reading your code, what you're actually referring to. Of course, you can feel free to completely ignore any advice that I've just given you there. It's an important thing to make your own decision unless you're working in a group that already has a set of conventions in place. Pick something that makes sense to you. Now that we've got the names of the objects out of the way, we can modify a few of the other properties. So for example, for the group box, I'd want to change the text of the group box. So again, I can use the properties window, scroll down to find the text property, and modify that from group box 1. I'm going to call this, I'm going to say your details. If I can spell, there we go. I can do the same thing for the labels. So for the label 1 text, I can change that so that it says, let's see, first name. And for label 2, I can call that last name. And for label 3, that will be date of birth. Just as with the form, there are various formatting properties available as well. So for instance, if I want to change any colours about the forecolor or the back colour, I'll find properties for that. So there's a forecolor and the back colour, and that works in exactly the same way as for the form itself. There's a font property as well for a label and a text box. If I expand the font, you can see that you've got sub-properties inside there that allow you to choose which font you're using and its size and so on and so on. These are all relatively easy properties to investigate and play around with in your own time, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with them right here. Just be aware that you can modify things using the properties window. Of course, some controls do have different properties available than others. So for example, a date time picker has unique properties to do with its calendar. So if I select the date time picker and look in the properties window, there will be a set of unique properties available for formatting the calendar. I'll also see unique properties for things like changing, creating a custom format for the date. I can also do things like set the minimum and maximum date allowed. So the maximum date you're allowed to enter here is the 31st of the 12th, 1998. There's also the minimum date, which is the 1st of January 1753. Seems to be quite an arbitrary value, but there is a really good reason actually for this being 1st of the 1st, 1753. But I'll let you look that one up if you're really, really interested. I think we don't want anybody quite so old applying for our dating agency, so what we could do is modify that date either by typing something in. So we could say 1st of the 1st, so I don't know, what should we say, 1900? It's still fairly old, but it's certainly a lot younger than 1753. And we could do the same with the max date as well, so we could restrict that to a different date. But this is just to indicate that different control types have different available properties. Now there are just a few more controls I'd like to add to make the form a bit more complete. So to add more controls, I'm first of all going to have to right click and choose to unlock the controls by choosing lock controls. And I need to make the form a little bit larger to facilitate the extra controls I'm going to add. I'm going to add them into the group box as well, my details group box. So the first thing I'm going to add is something called a combo box, and this is a drop-down list that allows me to select from a range of items. So I scroll in the toolbox to find the combo box. I'm going to add one of those just below the date of birth. And I'm going to use this combo box to allow the user to select what gender they are. Now there are several different methods for populating the values available in a combo box, but we're going to manually key in our values for this example. There are two places I can do that. One is in the Properties window. I can find the Items property, and I can select items and click on the little ellipsis that appears, and then in the dialog box I can type in, hitting enter after each one, I can type in the values I want to display in the list. So let's just go with a couple of basic choices for now. Let's have male and female, and when I click OK, that will populate the combo box with those two items. I'm also going to add a combo box to allow the user to select what gender they're searching for. So I'm going to add another combo box by dragging it from the toolbox, and I'm going to make it the same size as the other one, or try that again, there we go. And I'm going to populate this combo box using this little arrow in the top right hand corner. So rather than going to the Properties window, I can click on this little arrow that appears, and I can choose to edit the items in this little drop down list. So that opens up the dialog box without having to go to the Properties window. So I'm going to make the choices again fairly basic for now. I'm going to say male and female. Click OK, and those are the two combo boxes added. I need to give them sensible names, of course, following my naming conventions. So I'm going to select the first one, and I'm going to change its name to, I'm going to call this one Your Gender, which is going to be, I'm going to call it a list, so Your Gender List. And then the next one, I'm going to change so that it's Their Gender List. I can then add a couple of labels to help me describe what I need to select to the user. So I can add a label there for the combo box, and I'll change its name so that it's called Your Gender Label. And I'll change its text so that it says something more descriptive, so Your Gender. And then again I'll add another label just next to this one, this combo box, which will store, let's see, this will be Their Gender. So I'm going to call this one, I'll set the text, in fact, to Their Gender, or Partner Gender, I suppose I could have called it, and then change its name so that it's called Their Gender Label. As we've started adding some items to describe the partner, it might be worthwhile having a separate group for these controls. So rather than store it in the Your Details group, we could expand the form to have another group box side by side. So I can do that and drag in another group box, and I'll position that one next to the first, and I'll resize that one to make it match roughly the same size. I'm going to change the name of this group box. So the first one, if we remember, was called Applicant Details Group. What we're going to do with this one is call this one Partner Details Group. So I'm going to change the name of this one, so it's called Partner Details Group. And I'll change its text as well, so that it's called, so that it says at the top of it Partner Details. So find the text property and call that one Partner Details. Now I already have some controls in my previous group that I want to move. So if I want to move their gender controls, I can drag and to select the label and the combo box, and simply click and drag to move those into the other group box. I can then add any other controls in there that I want to as well. Next, I'd like to provide a way for the user to choose the minimum and maximum age of their preferred partner. So I'm going to do that using a numeric up-down control, which you might also hear referred to as a spin button or a spinner control. So I'm going to drag one of those onto the form below their gender control, somewhere-ish. Get it positioned reasonably neatly. I'm going to change the name of this one so that it's called minimum age, and then I need to add some kind of descriptor to what type of item it is. So I'm going to say minimum age spinner. then I can add another one called maximum age spinner. So I can drag that one below the first, and I'll call that one maximum age spinner. What I can then do is add a couple of labels again, which is always the boring bit, but kind of needs to be done for the end user. So let's add a label, which we can, in fact, I'll add two labels, and let's call, or change the text in the first one, change the name of the first one so that it's called minimum age label. And we'll change its text so that it says minimum age. And the next one will change so that it says maximum age for the text, and we'll make sure that it's called maximum age label. So drawing forms does get a little bit tedious when you're repeating the same steps again and again and again, but it's one of those really important things to do, making sure all of your objects are designed and named appropriately. This could do with a little bit of tweaking. I get very, very fussy about making sure things line up and so on eventually. I shouldn't spend too much time doing that though. So there we go, those are the two numeric spinner controls. Numeric up-down controls have a couple of properties available that are unique to that type of control, just like for a date-time picker and a combo box. So we can set the minimum and maximum values allowed to be used in the spinner control. So what we can do is find for the minimum age spin button, let's scroll up to find the maximum and minimum. So we should set, I guess, a sensible limit for the minimum age allowed, which let's say that should be perhaps 18. And then for the maximum age, maybe 100 is going a bit far. Well, actually, maybe not. Let's be liberal about things. Let's leave the maximum age that we can look for as 100. Because I've changed the minimum age and the original default value for the spin button was, or the numeric up-down control was 0, it's actually changed that automatically, so the value properties also changed to 18. I could change that to something else if I preferred, but I think that makes sense. Leave that as 18. We should do the same thing for the maximum age button as well, so we should set the minimum and maximum values allowed in there. So we'll have 100 and we'll have 18 as well. But let's set the maximum age for the preferred partner. Let's set that to be 100. So there's the spin button controls set up. Just going back quickly to some layout options you've got available, it's difficult to tell, having drawn these controls side by side, whether they're the same size or not, and I would quite like these objects to be the same size. One thing I could do is check in the size property and make sure that they're exactly the same width, and as it turns out, I've actually guessed that pretty correctly. So they've both got a width of 155. Let's imagine that I hadn't judged that quite so accurately though. Let's imagine that the gender text box was a little bit too narrow, or the combo box was a bit too narrow. What I could do is click on the first name checkbox, then hold down the control key and click on their gender combo box. And from the layout toolbar there's a make same width tool. There's also a make same height tool. If I click make same width, again remembering the option of the dominant control, the one with the white boxes, if I click make same width, it'll make their gender combo box the same width as the first name text box. So that can be quite handy when your controls are side by side rather than one above the other. I'm just going to very quickly make my minimum and maximum age spinners or numeric up-down controls a little bit narrower because they don't need to be quite so wide for this example. So that looks reasonably good. There's just one more control I'm going to add to the form before we're ready to start adding some code to it, which we'll do in the next video in the series. So the final control that I'm going to add is going to be a button that the user can click on to apply to the dating agency. So I'm going to just give myself a bit of space below my group boxes. I'm going to make them both the same height and then just reduce the size of the form slightly as well, just to give myself just enough space for a button down at the bottom. So the button I'm going to use is going to be called a button, of course. And if I drag one of those onto the form just below the group boxes, somewhere towards the bottom right hand corner, I can then change some standard properties of that. So the text I'm going to change so that it says apply now. And then the name of the button is, I'm going to change that so that it's called Apply Now Button, which is fairly unambiguous and descriptive as well. So there we go, there's the form, I think, neatly designed. We've also always got more opportunity to make changes to this later on and add more controls, but this will give us a nice starting point for starting to write some code in the next video. As one final thing we can do in this video, just to check that our form looks and behaves sensibly, we can actually run our application to see the form appear on screen as though it was running. So to do that is fairly trivial actually. Assuming all the default settings are in place, all you really need to do with what we've done so far is click the little Start button at the top on the toolbar. If I click this, then I'll see my application will begin to run. And what that does is it calls the main routine and runs any code in there. And one of the lines of code in there was to create a new instance of my Woda application form. So you can see it here clearly running on screen. If I just minimize some windows in the background, we ought to be able to see all this running on the desktop. So we should find that we'll be able to type stuff in to some of these controls and tab to the next control, and we should be able to choose dates using the drop down list to choose dates. The nice little date time picker control works in the standard way. You can zoom in and out to different levels and zoom back in to different levels. We can choose a gender from our drop-down list. We choose their gender from a drop-down list, and we should find our spin buttons work as well. So I can't go any lower than 18, but I can certainly go higher. I can't go any higher than 100, but I can certainly go lower than that, significantly lower than that. And then when I click the Apply Now button, nothing will happen, obviously, because we haven't written any code to make that button do anything. But the important thing is you can test your form out so you can see that it is actually behaving sensibly. If you remember, we made sure that our form had a sizable dialog style, so we can resize our form. We could restrict that if we decide that that's not appropriate. I think we've designed quite a nicely, sensibly sized form, so we might want to restrict users from now resizing the form and various other things as well. But at this point, I'm going to go back and I'm going to close down the application. I'm going to click the cross in the top right hand corner. That will close down the application and take us back to the Visual Studio Editor. You'll get an output window that shows you various things that have happened while your application was running, and the last thing that will happen is that your application has exited. So just a neat way to test that your application, your form, looks sensible when it's actually running. Click the Start button to run the application. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.